give it a couple of minutes for people online to trickle in.
Okay.
Hi, Kat. Good to see you.
Hello, disembodied voice.
Sorry, this is Annie's unbodied voice hanging out. Hello. I'm in the screen now a little bit.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, I'm sorry not to be down there with you guys, but glad we can still do this.
Yes, absolutely. We're just giving a couple minutes for people to trickle in. I think we're also still waiting for Richard. Hopefully he will.
Okay.
Oh, he's here? Okay, great. I just can't see him up there.
Hello.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Oh yeah, talked alongside.
All right, great. Then I think we are all ready to go. We have our full lineup of panelists. We have our speaker. We have people in the room and online. So I'm going to go ahead and give a little introduction now, if you're ready, Martin.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the last talk in the 2024 rendition of the L Talks, the Edinburgh Lectures in Language Evolution. I'm Annie. I'm one of the organizers, along with Kenny's in the back row here, if you're in person. And if you're not in person, you can't see him, but he's right here. And then we also have Sid and Vlad. Vlad is here online helping out with the tech. I just want to give a big shout out to the team for helping pull this through. I also want to thank the CLE and the Center for Doctoral Training in Natural Language Processing, the UKRI, for helping sponsor the reception that we're going to have after this. I'm very sad that several of our speakers will not be able to attend, but we'll do a rain check on that, and next time you're in Edinburgh, we'll make it happen. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Martin Haspelmath. Martin is a senior research scientist at the Department of Linguistics and Cultural Evolution at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Leipzig. He got his PhD at Freie University in 1993 and has since become a household name in comparative linguistics and typology throughout our field. I know that myself and I think many other people in this room owes a huge debt of gratitude to Martin for his work on many databases that I know that we use daily here at Edinburgh and probably daily at many other departments across the world. He has contributed and co-edited Glottolog, the World Atlas of Language Structures, and also contributed to the new GramBank database, giving us access to the most comprehensive overview of linguistic features that we currently have access to date. He also writes an amazing blog, if you haven't checked that out. It's called Diversity Linguistics Comments, and he has been doing that since 2012 and posting regularly, which is an amount of dedication that is frankly staggering. So just for that, I think we should all go and read it. I think Martin exhibits a sort of definition of how a linguist can contribute in different levels of our field, in everything from specific linguistic features and such as passive participles, writing about indefinite pronouns, or even grammars of specific Caucasian languages. Makes him sound, you know, like a real linguist doing real linguistics things. And then on top of that, he also contributes to big picture questions in our field about human linguistic capacity, how universals fit into our theory making, and what even is markedness, which I think personally is an excellent question. Having a linguist who is so willing and able to contribute at these different levels of our field with such expertise and thoughtfulness is really inspiring, and we're very happy to welcome him here today and to have him give us his perspective in our series on language evolution. So whenever you're ready, Martin, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annie, and also Kenny and everyone else in Edinburgh for putting this together and for inviting me. It's a pity that I can't be there in person. I wasn't well over the weekend and decided to cancel the trip, but I'm well enough today. And so I'll tell you about some of my thoughts. As Annie mentioned, I've been interested in big picture questions in addition to my work on comparative linguistics. And so this talk will be different from the preceding three talks, which focused on empirical issues. This one will focus on conceptual issues and also put questions in historical perspective. I guess that's maybe also somewhat appropriate given my age. I think I'm the oldest of the speakers. And so, you know, as you grow older, you think more about how it all fits in and what our ancestors were doing and so on. So the first question is, what is language evolution? The second question, what have linguists learned from biological evolution? The third, why is natural kinds linguistics still so attractive? And the fourth, what explains language universals? This is sort of where it all started for me, because since I was a linguistics student in the 1980s, I was fascinated by universals of grammar of the Greenbergian type, and I kept wondering throughout my career what explains them. And here, tentative answer that I want to suggest today is that it's constraints on selected outcomes, not constraints on innovations or pathways of change, because typological similarities derive from diverse sources. So that's just a very brief overview. So the first conceptual issue, quite relevant to the lectures on language evolution. What is language evolution? Does it refer to diachronic change or only to the origin of the language capacity or to both? So, you know, I've been in linguistics since the 80s, and until the 1990s, evolution really always meant language origins, and it was really fringe.
Martin, excuse me.
Yeah.
Are we meant to have moved on from your introductory slide, or is it still meant to be on the introductory slide?
No, we're meant to have moved on. So
okay, we have not moved on yet. So
okay, so it says your screen sharing is paused. So apparently the screen sharing doesn't work.
okay, why don't you stop your screen share and start it again?
Okay. Now like this and like this. Yeah, thanks for saying this.
No worries. It just felt like there probably would be some
Yes.
bullet points somewhere.
So these were the four questions. What is language evolution?
Okay, we can still only see the first slide.
Okay, so what's happening? It worked earlier, didn't it?
Yeah. So what about if we do it the other way around so that you press play and then go into screen share?
Okay. Right. You're evidently quite experienced with this. So, mm, yeah, and I'm not so experienced because I normally give on in-person talks these days.
Yeah.
So, does it work now? No.
Sorry.
You can also maybe just use the slides.
You can also just leave it like this,
Yes.
Martin. You don't. Oh. Oh, yay!
Now it works.
You
Okay.
figured it out. Well done. All
Well,
right,
I
let's
just,
continue.
I just-
Sorry for the interruption.
I just tried. So these are the 4 questions. What's language evolution? What have we learned from biological evolution? Why is natural kinds linguistics so attractive? And what explains these universals? So what's language evolution? So when Bybee 1994 came out, The Evolution of Grammar, that was really a sort of shock for me because she was talking about grammaticalization all the time, about language change. And and then evolution was in this title. I had been sort of associated with Bybee's work and very interested in grammaticalization. And suddenly I felt it was sort of renamed to evolution. And then I joined the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in '98. And of course, I realized, this fantastic big building and so on. It was prestigious. And I also became very interested in parallels between language change and biological evolution, in particular in adaptation. So in 1999, I wrote this paper, Optimality and Diachronic Adaptation, that actually Simon Kirby wrote a commentary on. I've been interested in these things for a quarter century. And I've sort of known about the Edinburgh work also for quite a while. So I felt that many cross-linguistically consistent grammatical patterns showed a clear signature of adaptation to the language user's need. Uh, so, this comes back to the markedness that Annie mentioned at the beginning. So Greenberg was talking about asymmetric coding of tense. Present tense has no marker, future tense has a special marker, or asymmetric coding of patient role. In Spanish, the inanimate patient or object doesn't get a marker, but when you have an animate object, I see Maria, it's veo a Maria. So these were talked about in terms of markedness by many linguists, but I felt that didn't reflect the functional adaptedness of language structures, because it's evidently good if speakers can do without a special present tense marker, because present tense is the most frequent situation, or the inanimate patient is more common than the animate patient. So I felt that adaptation was needed. But not many people followed that, and then language evolution and evolutionary linguistics became more and more widely used. So in 2013, there was this textbook on evolutionary linguistics, but it wasn't clear to me what they meant. So I kind of always thought it would be better to distinguish clearly between 2 kinds of evolution, because on an evolutionary view, language change is quite different from the evolutionary emergence of the capacity for language. So one might distinguish, for example, between diachrony, change of a language, or actually evolution of a language, and glottogony, for example, evolution of human language. Fitch actually suggested glossogeny versus phylogeny for these 2. He kind of liked new terms too. I think the problem really is that language has 2 very different senses in English, or rather different senses. It can refer to a particular language, where French has une langue, or to human language in general, where French has le langage. So in French, you would distinguish between l'évolution d'une langue or l'évolution du langage. And in English, both can be language evolution. So I feel there's some confusion there. I also have a paper where I say we really need to distinguish more carefully between particular linguistics and general linguistics. And from a biological perspective, we probably need a third term, namely for the biologic prerequisites for language, analogically, analogous to musicality. So this was also inspired by Fitch, who in 2015 wrote a nice paper on biomusicology. And I thought, well, biolinguistics certainly is, if you do it like Fitch, it's certainly a field that should exist, looking at the biological prerequisites. So I have this paper where I coined the term linguisticality on the analogy of musicality. So, Chomsky has sometimes simply said universal grammar for the biological prerequisites, but then sometimes universal grammar is defined more narrowly. And so there's a lot of conceptual confusion also in generative grammar. So I think one should probably distinguish between evolution of linguisticality, evolution of human language for the biocultural complex, and evolution of individual languages. But confusingly, many people, also people that I respect greatly, seem to think that the evolutionary emergence of human language structure is a simple case of the ubiquitous process of grammaticalization. In particular, Mike Tomasello, who was my colleague at the Max Planck Institute for quite a few years, in his book Constructing a Language, says that, there's a generative approach where the idea is that the human species evolved genetically based universal grammar common to all peoples. The alternative is a usage-based view in which there's no need to posit specific genetic adaptation for grammar because processes of grammaticization and syntacticization can actually create grammatical structure out of concrete utterances. So he feels once we have this cultural historical process, we don't have to sort of account for the emergence of the ability of grammar anymore. But of course, grammaticalization is a very important kind of change in historical linguistics. So syntactic patterns can become more compact and give rise to complex words. So the famous Romance future tense is something that every linguist probably knows. Spanish cantará comes from cantare habet. So this has been a very popular topic over the last few decades, and I've contributed to the topic. But I feel that we don't really understand why it happens and whether it must be associated with a usage-based view. Also, it's very unclear whether all of grammar arises by grammaticalization, rather than just grammatical markers such as future markers or accusative markers, for example. So I have a recent blog post in the blog that Annie mentioned at the beginning, where 20 years after some of my most widely cited papers on grammaticalization, I sort of say that I don't really feel that older work has been sort of very, very deep in its understanding, and I want to be more modest now about grammaticalization. So I don't know about the Tomasello type approach. And in 2016, I wrote a blog post criticizing the ambiguity of the expression language evolution, which has actually come to be widely cited. So Plyer and Hartmann, in their 2024 booklet, for example, they say that it's actually okay to conflate evolution of language and evolution of languages, because such a conflation, they say, follows naturally from an approach that conceives of languages as social and cultural objects. And then they cite Bybee, who has a view similar to Tomasello's. There's every reason to suppose that the very first grammatical constructions emerged in the same way as those observed in more recent history. Well, I'm not sure about that at all. So I think that's too speculative for me. But Tom Scott Phillips then actually made an interesting comment responding on my blog, saying that we need to distinguish three things. First, the biological evolution of the capacity for language, then the change from simple systems to characteristically linguistic systems, and third, the change from one system to another. He says that language evolution, in his understanding, concerns 1 and 2, while diachronic linguistics concerns 3. Now, again, I'm not really sure what the very simple systems to characteristically linguistic systems are. I know that quite a few people work on this, but excluding diachronic linguistics also seems kind of restrictive and not really in line in what, for example, the Journal of Language Evolution does or wants to do. They actually changed their ancient scope statement in response to my blog post. They now say language evolution is concerned with the question of how language came to be and how it came to be the way it is today. That's a really odd statement. What does it mean to say how it came to be the way it is today? Human language? Well, de facto, they actually publish quite a bit of straightforward historical linguistics. So I think they should say concerned with the questions of how language came to be and how languages come to be different or something like that, and how these two might relate. So anyway, I'm not convinced that it's clear that there's a relationship between this. Maybe language evolution has come to designate a scholarly community who have decided to come together at conferences and maybe cite each other. That's certainly fine. I mean, I think actually my field, typology, is really more like a community. It includes many field linguists, for example. It's not really defined conceptually. And just a few days ago, I saw that there's this term language evolution folks. This kind of really designates a community, as everybody's moving to blue sky. You want to sort of find your friends on the new social platform. Anyway, so I think we need to distinguish between conceptual issues and kind of naming communities. And communities is perfectly fine, of course. Okay, now a bit more about history. So what have linguists learned from biological evolution? So it was long unclear how to compare biological linguistic evolution, and it's kind of still unclear. And kind of for me, the most striking and in a way depressing part of this is the idea, actually going back to Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the founders of comparative grammar, is sort of implicit idea that language types are like human racial types. So, when you go to the origin of these well-known typological labels like isolating versus inflecting languages. So 1808, Friedrich von Schlegel, synthetic versus analytic languages. 10 years later, his brother August Wilhelm von Schlegel. Then 4 years later, Wilhelm von Humboldt himself coined the term agglutinating languages. And yeah, he also had a famous brother who wasn't a linguist, but who sometimes brought manuscripts from South America that Wilhelm von Humboldt then analyzed because he was also very interested in languages of sort of the other races, the kind of less advanced people. So this is kind of a distinctly pre-modern view, even though in a way at the time it was quite modern because all four were students in Göttingen in the 1790s, and their professor was Blumenbach, who was well known for having set up this sort of 4 of 5 major races like Caucasian and Mongolian and Malayan and Ethiopian and so on. So that was really cutting edge historical science at the time. Nowadays, it's considered racist, of course, and gave rise to these well-known world maps of the different races that we now feel sort of a bit ashamed of or so, but that was the time. But what I find it sort of a bit depressing is that in linguistics, we're kind of still stuck with these old labels like analytic, fusional, agglutinative, and so on. So, when you go to YouTube, you'll find all these nice videos explaining the difference between the different language types in these very simplistic ways. And of course, they're kind of salient, but because of the history in the 19th century when sort of white people in rich Western countries thought that they were more advanced or so, that sometimes shouldn't be forgotten. Anyway, yeah, then there was Schleicher in 1863, who famously said that a language is like a biological organism. That was discussed a lot, and even Darwin cited some of his work then later because he was intrigued by the trees of linguists, but also it didn't really work. Then Pinker and Bloom, 1990, a century later, said that the language organ is like other organs and evolved, has the same adaptive value as other organs. I'm not going to get into that. I'm kind of was more interested in work like Croft 2000, who tried to explain the cultural evolution of languages, language change with notions derived from evolutionary biology. Said that linguistic utterances are populations, which is also a bit strange, and I never really fully understood it. So he said that the lingueme, like the gene, is a replicator in language evolution, a locus of variation and selection. But it wasn't clear, is a lingueme a part of an utterance or a part of a system of conventions? So it seems to me that none of these attempts at learning from developments in biology have been big successes. Now, what about this label, cultural evolution? So there's actually a recent paper that came out 2 days ago, I think, by Boyd and Richardson in PNAS. Cultural evolution is turning 50. So how does it relate to languages? Well, in Boyd and Richardson, in this paper, it's sort of an overview paper looking back, there's almost nothing about linguistic evolution. I know about cultural attraction theory by Scott Phillips and others. I think Dan Sperber probably also associated. But again, it hasn't made much impression on linguists. Also, they rarely talk about adaptation. They talk a lot about functions, and there's a kind of ideological division between functionalism and formalism, but not much attempt to make contact with relevant developments, either in evolutionary biology or in the kind of thriving, rich field of cultural evolution studies. Linguists also rarely talk about convergent evolution, even though it should be clear that typological features recur across different families because of parallel evolution. So, I've kind of long been interested in these, but I haven't seen any major breakthroughs. So I'm not sure. Should I be waiting for something like an evolutionary synthesis or so? I'm kind of certainly hoping that there will be sort of more people asking big picture questions or giving at least some tentative big picture answers. Okay, so a little bit about natural kinds linguistics. So Chomsky and generative linguistics still very popular in linguistics departments and many language departments. And yeah, I've been wondering why that is so. So they assume that the similarities and differences between languages can be explained by a rich set of innate categories, person, number, mood, case, noun, verb, clause, and so on, and that we may eventually determine these innate elements of grammar by analyzing individual languages. So they think that they're natural kinds, like the chemical elements. So, and there's actually a very nice book by Mark Baker, which I can recommend as an introduction to that way of thinking, The Atoms of Language. So the idea that these categories are sort of given to us in advance, and that each language is a mixture, like a complex compound of the different elements of language. So that's clearly not absurd, but my feeling is the progress has not been great. So maybe people continue with this because linguists are very much focused on individual languages. Few of us do comparative linguistics, whereas comparative biology was long the main approach of most biologies, actually. I think before the end of the 19th century, when microbiology became very important and prestigious, most biologists were working in the field or in museums. And somehow the functional adaptive evolutionary explanations that I'm interested in have not made a sufficient impression on the field. And I keep wondering why that is. So, sometimes I think, in a way, linguistics is perhaps at a stage where biology was in the early 19th century, before Darwin's evolutionary revolution. So, in the 18th and 19th century, biologists knew about two types of similarities. Similarities due to functional adaptation, uh, not clearly formally based. So the birds and the bats, maybe they didn't have pterosaurs, but even insects, insect wings are uh, similar. But then there are also homologies, where there are formal similarities but unrelated function. So where different vertebrates have rather different limbs, like the bat's wings or the fins of dolphins and so on. So biologists and also philosophers were really interested in the differences between these analogies and homologies. So natural theology was clearly interested in analogy because it was clearly explained by the benevolent creator, whereas biologists such as Richard Owen focused on the homologies. In France, Georges Cuvier was a well-known representative of analogies and of adaptive view, and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was very much pushing for homologies. Actually, in Germany, Goethe was more philosopher, but he was very much on the side of homologies, and he coined the term morphology for this, and then later was adopted into linguistics as well. So it comes from Goethe's philosophical biology, basically. So early explanations for adaptation were the benevolent creator, and Goethe was struggling to find an explanation for the protoplant, the Urpflanze. And this kind of reminds me of what we have in linguistics, where the adaptationists are sort of the functionalists, sometimes maybe a bit naive, like natural theology, and the uh, the emphasis on pure form is kind of more like the Chomskyians, the generative grammar. There was this really fascinating Cuvier-Geoffroy debate in 1830, which has a nice Wikipedia article. And Goethe was already old, but he was fascinated by that debate. I read about this, and when I read about this, I wrote this blog post about it. Anyway, so once Darwin came along, he had an explanation for both of them. The analogies are explained by adaptation, by evolutionary change and natural selection, and homologies are explained by inheritance from a common ancestor. So suddenly these big debates and discussions kind of disappeared, and Darwin solved the problem. And so when I realized this, I thought maybe in linguistics we sort of need, a kind of, resolve the big debate between functionalism and formalism by, recognizing the crucial role of evolution and adaptation in shaping language structures. But linguistics is still very compartmentalized. There are not too many attempts at creating a unified picture. Okay, so after these somewhat sober comments, now let me get to the fourth question, where I have a tentative answer, namely, what explains language universals? I distinguish three kinds of explanations: biocognitive constraints on possible language systems. So this is a kind of Chomskyan idea of innate elements, innate universal grammar. Functional adaptive constraints on outcomes of change. I think Givon, 1979, was one of the first people to push this prominently. And the third is an explanation by innovation constraints or pathway constraints on changes. And this is something that John Bybee has been emphasizing over the last 20 years. So briefly, again, biocognitive constraints, the idea that innate categories and features are restrictive, they allow only actually tested systems. Well, I don't want to totally dismiss this, because psychologists have actually proposed something like core knowledge systems independently of language structures. Spelke and others, they say that notions like objects, agents, quantities, physical properties are actually innately given. There's also the idea of a set of 5 innate emotions, quite independently of language systems, by Ekman and others. So happiness, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. There's even a Hollywood movie about this. But linguists who propose innate explanations rarely make contact with other proposals for innate psychological categories. I don't know why that is. Maybe because these nativist linguists have been so strongly influenced by Chomsky, and Chomsky isn't really interested in other domains of psychology. I don't know. So I don't have more to say on the biocognitive constraints. I'm more interested, as I said, by the functional adaptive constraints. So the idea that actually tested systems are limited because of convergent evolution to optimal states, which allow more efficient production and perception. This is actually very, very similar, or exactly the same as Richard Futrell said last time. He had this sort of nice figure where he had sort of several different optima for like English and Mandarin and so on. So I think this is the most promising approach, though it should not be adopted uncritically as the only possibility, as I said. So I want to be a bit cautious. And the third one is the innovation constraints or pathway constraints. So the idea that the actually tested systems derive from a restricted set of sources or diachronic pathways. So not any kind of change is possible, and that limits the kind of synchronic system. So I also call this constraints on change or mutational constraints in an earlier paper. This is an interesting alternative to the functional adaptive perspective, and it may seem quite similar to it. So I've been strongly influenced by Bybee, and for a long time I thought that there was not really a contrast. But actually, when you read her 88 paper, it's a bit odd. So she says, in language universals, causal factors are linguistic changes that create particular synchronic change. The existence of massive cross-language similarity in synchronic change implies powerful parallels in linguistic change. So the same outcomes must come from the same changes, is what she says. So she doesn't envisage convergence from different areas. She says the validity of a principle as explanatory can only be maintained if it can be shown that the same principle also plays a role in the establishment of the conventions that describes the generalization. So she says that the change must be shown to be motivated by the outcome. And she says actually the mechanisms of change are clearer as universals. And so she has this paper of 2006 where she says the true universals of language are the mechanisms of change. So there's also Blevins, Anderson, and a few others in recent years, especially Sonia Cristofaro, who have expressed very similar views. So Bybee's best known for her work on the path of change for tense aspect categories. So past tenses come from perfective or perfect aspects, and they come from a limited selection of grammaticalization origins. Similarly, present or imperfectives come from progressives, and they also come from a limited set of sources. Also, futures come from a limited set of sources. So Bybee feels that these pathways are kind of really what's universal. And she also talks about phonological pathways because she also worked extensively on phonological change, but I'm not going to talk about that here. I think that one problem with this is that these paths may be universal and restricted, so I don't want to dispute that, but they don't necessarily give rise to synchronic universals. So there may be both true diachronic universals and true synchronic universals. So, what are universals about present, perfective, or perfective, about futures and so on. The universals are really of the asymmetric coding type that Greenberg talked about. So futures tend to have a special marker, but that does not follow from their origins. So it seems to me that the explanation does not really work the way Bybee says. And I think the efficiency-based functional adaptive explanations are really much better. So I think grammatical coding is efficient primarily in two ways. Namely, element order tends to allow efficient processing of constituents. That's what Richard Futrell talked about yesterday. And the first important book on this was by Hawkins in 1994. And the second is that asymmetric coding in grammar tends to be due to frequency and predictability asymmetry. So this is what used to be called markedness. And so I have this paper against markedness, and I was sort of saying, okay, it's not markedness, and now I'm saying it's efficiency-based functional adaptation. So, as I said earlier, I felt that many cross-linguistically consistent patterns show clear signature adaptation, like future tense tends to be marked, animate patients tend to be marked, and so on. So I give a few more examples of more languages here. So future tense mark is pretty consistent, not just English, also Latin, laudant versus laudabunt, or kiribati, etaita, he speaks, enataita, he will speak. Or plural marking, it's not just, English forms like book, books, but it's Hebrew, yom, yamim for day, days, or chanti, chot, chotet. Actually, it's dual, also pretty consistently, still longer than the plural. We have differential object marking, not just Spanish, but also Armenian and Hindi and Chinese and so on. It's really found throughout the world. Differential possessive marking is another phenomenon that I looked at. It's sort of a bit more exotic, but in Maltese, for example, you have ed, my hand, but for ktieb, which is book, you cannot say ktiebi, my book. You have to use a longer form, ktieb, ti. Then there's causative and anti-causative marking. So that gets still more complex, and I won't elaborate on that today, but I worked on it a lot, and it was really intriguing for me when I realized that there's a relationship with frequency there too. So with break, it's kind of more likely, more frequent to use it transitively. So there's a special marker on the intransitive, like sukasi in French or lamatza in Russian, whereas with boil, it's kind of more likely to use it intransitively. So for the transitive, you need a special marker like faire bouillir in French or kipetit in Russian, and so on. So this asymmetric coding exhibits functional adaptation. It's beneficial to language users. Coding with predictable information using less effort for that is efficient, and it results from an earlier evolutionary process. So in many cases, we can actually say how these arose. So for Maltese, for example, we sort of know what the earlier Arabic origin of this was, or how the French sukasi construction arose, and so on. So now, going back to the Bybee Cristoforo type approach, can these synchronic regularities be explained by constraints on innovations or pathways? I would like to suggest that the causal relationship is really the reverse. Linguistic innovations are largely random, like biological mutations, and propagation or diffusion in language change is driven both by social factors and by functional factors. So it's a little bit like maybe sexual selection in biology, which is sort of more social factor and kind of the more purely survival-based other factors. So it seems to me that we can probably say that language users unconsciously prefer efficient variance in language use, which results in overall efficient systems. So change is often result-oriented, not in the sense of teleological, but in the sense that what matters is the result, what's selected for is the outcome, and that puts a constraint on the change. So their starting points and trajectories can be very diverse. And this is similar to biological evolution, where we often see convergent evolution. So it's these typical cases of wings in different taxa. So now, just a few more examples. I don't want to get into too much linguistically detail because this is also meant to be interdisciplinary, but I think you'll get the idea. So future tense marking can arise from multiple sources, and I think they're actually richer than what Bybee says. So it can come from want or must or go, but there's also possibility, for example, for a new present tense to arise in modern Hebrew. So the yichtov is actually the old present tense, and the innovated present tense is sort of actually a bit shorter. So you can have these zero versus overt marking contrasts arising from rather different situations, or the contrast between singular and plural marking, where tends to be an extra marker for plural. That plural markers can come from group nouns. So in Seychelles Creole, femme is woman, ban femme is women. Well, it comes from a group of women. But in many languages, plural markers, new plural markers arise by sort of analogical extension, not by grammaticalization. So, like even Spanish muros, the walls, Latin had mura, right? The S came from some other nouns and was analogically extended. Or in English, there's sort of one plural marker in S that survived and that spread to many others. Differential object marking can come from multiple sources. So Spanish a comes from a dative, Russian a from a genitive, Afrikaans vir from for, Batavia Creole kung from with, Persian ra from concerning, Sri Lankan Malay young from a relative marker. So there's all kinds of possibilities. And there's differential possessive marking, which actually seems to be attested in Lancashire English, according to Holman and Shiverska at least. They distinguish, maybe not fully consistently, between me brother and my football shoes. So the short form me is used for inalienable, for kinship terms. But in Maltese, clearly the longer form for alienable possession comes from an extra marker. So it's very different sources can give rise to very similar synchronic situation. And the same for causative and anti-causative marking, where causative markers can come from full verbs like make. They can arise by analogical extension, as in Hindi. They can come, anti-causative markers can come from pronouns, or they can arise by analogical extension. So there's really a range of possibilities for how certain consistent typological patterns can arise. And for me, that's really more like the convergent evolution we see in biology. Okay, yeah, this already brings me to my concluding remarks. So first of all, of course, there's still a number of open conceptual and terminological issues in evolutionary linguistics, as I pointed out at the beginning, or for me at least, they're still open. And if you feel that everything is clear, then I think you haven't made it sufficiently clear to the rest of the field of linguistics. And the second point, well, establishing causality in language change is, of course, generally very difficult. So the main question is which scenarios are the most plausible. So my answer here is tentative, but the key point is that if synchronic grammatical systems exhibit a demonstrable tendency toward asymmetric coding, and there are really many of such cases, but if the sources and pathways of change are diverse and exhibit convergence on a uniform sort of target or outcome, then the resulting efficient pattern cannot be the initial cause of the change. So the result is not source-based, and the changes are not source-based, but sort of result-oriented. I think it's only the functional result that we can understand, not the change as such. And it seems to be very much like adaptation and convergent evolution in biology, where we do not understand the causes of the mutations well, but we often understand the functional developments quite well. And so in linguistics, therefore, when it comes to discussing Greenbergian type universals with respect to language change, then I think sort of a convergent evolution, functional, adaptive, result-oriented view is better than the Bybee type view, where the constraints are in the sources or in the types of changes. Okay, that's it. And there's probably some time for questions now, right?
Thank you very much, Martin. Don't know if you could hear the applause, but the applause were there. Okay, so we're going to start with a discussion from our panelists, and then we'll open the floor to questions in the room and also online. I'll try and keep an eye on online questions. Okay, Richard, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Thanks for a great talk. I took a lot of notes. I guess I'm still processing and coming up with my thoughts, but I guess I'll start by asking. So the key step seems to be the idea that you have random mutations on some level, and then it's one element of selection is functional. And that's where the functional convergent evolution really happens. I wonder, do you see that as related to pragmatics? Yeah, or more generally, how do you see, like in terms of that selection, is it something we should think about as part of pragmatics, part of processing? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't really know. I'm more a historical and typological linguist, so my focus really is on the bigger picture questions. And I mean, selection also in biology sort of has been formulated at multiple levels. But my general sense is that Bill Croft is not right when he says that selection happens only at the social level. So he's in his book from 2000, he cites quite a bit of sociolinguistics literature, work by people like Trudgill and the Milroys, who did a lot of empirical sociolinguistic research and were trying to kind of identify factors for changes that they could observe. But my feeling was that these changes that they could observe, or maybe in America above similarly, right? My feeling is that these changes are kind of too kind of narrow. You can, as a sociolinguist, you can really observe changes only over a few decades, and these big picture typological patterns that we look at, that we find in databases like the World Atlas of Language Structures or Gram Bank, or in what other typology, the kind of work that you've been doing, these really take centuries. And my fear is that sociolinguistics cannot contribute so much to it, but it's a real conundrum. So what Croft said in 2000 was that the functional factors come in at the level of innovation, but not at the level of language use by adults. Or at the level of of spreading an innovation. And it seems to me that perhaps the most salient way in which we make our languages efficient is by abbreviating forms. These days we do it with letter-based abbreviations or by clipping or something like that. So when this publishing brand Language Science Press, we abbreviate it as Langside Press, we just make it short and kind of sometimes brutal way. And then sometimes people pick up on it. Actually, many people say LSP, and kind of we didn't want that. But anyway, so when something becomes familiar, you want to make it short. And it seems to me that that is this kind of mechanism that is also also responsible for the changes elsewhere. But where exactly it happens, whether you want to say it's processing or pragmatics or so, I don't really know. We need to think about it more.
All right, thanks. I might have more questions later.
Okay, great. In the meantime, while you ponder if you have more questions, Richard, we'll come to Shira.
Hi, Martin. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and it's too bad you cannot be here in person. I wanted to ask, I was a bit surprised by what you said about cultural evolution and the fact that there's not a lot of convincing work linking this with language, because there's a lot of work coming from Simon Kirby and Kenny Smith and Jennifer Culbertson here in Edinburgh, and also others from other places, that at least the way I see it, they do just that. So I was wondering whether you find this type of work unconvincing, and if so, why?
No, what I wanted to say is that it hasn't made an impact in sort of, the other kinds of conferences that I go to. Last week I was at a cognitive linguistics conference in Krakow in Poland, for example, and people were talking about morphology, also many general issues or so, but they think of themselves as cognitive linguists, and they haven't heard of cultural evolution. And I was at a morphology conference in Vienna in August, and everybody there thinks they are morphologists and they have their morphological theories. And again, they know that language change is important, but they don't think of language change as cultural evolution. It's, I know about that work, in part because, I knew Jim Herford. He was actually, hanging out with some typologists in the 90s, and he kind of first invited a group of us to Edinburgh in the 90s. So I've been aware of that work, but because my kind of interests are exceptionally broad, probably. And now, of course, among typologists, the work by Culbertson and others is now getting better and better known, clearly. But the work by Kirby and Smith is it's not been so typological, and so it has had a relatively narrow set of kinds of impact or so. That's just what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And
So you're saying
also,
there's not enough kind of crosstalk between different fields of
yes,
language?
right,
Okay.
right, and also, sometimes, if you just kind of go to language evolution conferences, right? Okay, you hang out with your friends, but others go to other kinds of conferences, and then they don't meet you, and so that's a sort of phenomenon that I kind of find. And also the Journal of Language Evolution, I was sort of a bit puzzled when it was founded, and it was very strong focus on quantitative methods. And I thought, okay, so people interested in quantitative methods sort of go to that journal, but then what are the questions?
Yeah.
That's really addressing. That is sometimes then not so clear. And so what I see is kind of people clustering around certain methods and certain kind of smaller areas, and losing the big picture questions out of sight. So that's somehow what I've been observing in linguistics. Maybe it's a bigger problem for other sciences as well. I can very well imagine that. But anyway, I mean, certainly organizing this lecture series is a good step toward broadening the impact of that field.
Can I ask another question, or I can ask it later? Okay. I wanted to make sure whether I understood you correctly. So when you were talking about different possible explanations for language universals, you talked about learnability as like hard constraints. So like some languages could be learned and others are just impossible to learn. Whereas things like the tendency for efficiency is something that can unfold over time. Did I understand you correctly? Like, does that mean that learning is a more rigid constraint, the way you understand it, than efficiency, for example?
Well, the way it was traditionally presented in linguistics, and I'm aware that in your work, for example, the idea is that universals may come from learning biases that are sort of not hard constraints, but just biases. And this is really a relatively new idea in linguistics, I think. And so I think I first heard about it, 10 or 12 years ago or so. Before that, the Chomskyan, as I said, the Chomskyan approach is still very strong, and it's the one that people who are not Chomskyans are the most likely to know about. And the Chomskyan approach, it's the learnability is really it's a hard constraint, and learnability is a soft constraint, is a bias, is something relatively new, and I don't know, maybe also in the work by you and your colleagues, it hasn't been emphasized enough how your learnability biases relate to the Chomsky style hard constraints on learnability, how they differ from them or so. At least that's my reaction. I don't know. Talk to other people. My feeling was when I first saw this, well, okay, so do you want to say that there's Chomsky style UG after all, except that it's a relatively weak thing that can be overridden or something like that. And also in the diachronic community, there's a pretty strong view now, as far as I know, that children do not contribute much to language change. And so if you want to put the learning biases in child language acquisition, then that's a problem for it. I think you actually mentioned it in your talk, if I remember correctly, and I don't remember exactly how you resolved it, but there's a tension there. And so again, this is something that I think the field as a whole should try to address in a frontal way, and kind of not gloss over it from my perspective. Maybe now with the large language models, and with Geoffrey Hinton winning the Nobel Prize, kind of Chomsky really receding sort of into the background. It becomes less important to address this Chomskyan view, also in typology or so. But kind of in my corner of the world, it's still pretty strong. Actually, has been getting stronger in North America. So, my experience is that, if you were a field linguist going to Brazil or Peru studying, or Guatemala studying an indigenous language there, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have to do minimalism, but nowadays you sort of have to, and it's kind of still very strong, and so that's why I keep thinking about it.
Thank you. So more work to be done. Thanks.
Great. Kat, can we hear from you now, please? I think I was told earlier that Kat is having some renovations done in her flat, which is very loud, and so it might be, depending on how loud they were exactly when we got to this part, she might not be able to contribute right now. So I will just say that we will leave the floor open for her to come back. Richard, have you thought of anything else you would like to ask before we get back to the main room?
Yeah, So Martin, you should feel free to say that you've just already answered this. But I keep thinking about these arguments I had with Charles Yang, where he was saying, look, these functional things you think you're finding, these are all just expected under the right model of random evolution, and they're all just epiphenomenal. Things like word length, frequency, covariance is just from something like monkeys randomly typing on a typewriter and randomly hitting the space bar. These criticisms that were leveled against like Zipf's law of abbreviation. Yeah, so I think your response would be something like, just look at the convergent evolution. You can't explain all this stuff that way. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything more to say on that.
The random typing, no, unfortunately not. That's sort of an old objection to Zipfian, the Zipfian explanation in terms of frequency and efficiency. And there's a lot of literature on Zipf's law of abbreviation from a very quantitative perspective. But I'm kind of a more qualitative person, and I've been kind of strongly influenced by John Bybee, who emphasized the very strong evidence for the role of frequency in language processing and language storage. So the most frequent forms are stored better, and also pretty strong evidence that speakers or language users kind of know how frequent certain expressions are, right? They remember, they can assess the likelihood that you will understand what I mean um, on the basis of the length of my utterance. So I think it's a pretty good match between our understanding of memory and pragmatics and how communication works and the way languages work. And that happens both at the level of utterances. So, when you look at utterances, you see strong evidence for efficient word order, as you do in your corpus linguistics. You also see strong evidence for efficient use of, longer versus shorter noun phrases and so on. And then there's a very strong match, what Hawkins called the performance grammar correspondence between the performance regularities and the grammatical regularities. And I find all those correlations kind of persuasive, or not to say compelling, but of course it's not proof, and I don't know how to actually prove to an ultra skeptic like Charles Yang that is the case, and so I cannot really give you an answer, just give you a kind of richer characterization of why I'm not so worried about that kind of objection.
Thanks.
Excellent. Then I would like to open up questions to the room. We don't have any questions online currently, but if you are online and would like to ask a question, please feel free to either type it in the Q&A or raise your hand and I will try to call on you. Okay, we have a question in the room, so I'm just going to hand over the mic.
Hiya. Throughout your talk, you've talked a lot about like kind of processes of like diachronic change, like grammaticalization pathways and things like that. And like I feel like a lot of the time they're like that in itself is just used as like an explanation for like linguistic diversity or like convergent evolution of different structures. Like you have these constraints on different pathways, but like how can we go about like explaining why those constraints on those pathways exist in the first place? Or like whether are they like hard constraints? Do they develop over time? Is that like is that just like a small bias for a certain like making some kind of like analogy that is then like extrapolated over time for like iterations? Or yeah, I don't understand like where to go from there.
Yeah, right. So I did not really talk about how to explain the pathways that Bybee identified, and in general, that linguists who talk about grammaticalization as sort of big picture, how they explained, and I wondered about this, especially in the 1990s, and I had a paper trying to explain why grammaticalization is irreversible. And back then, 25 years ago, the sort of answer that I gave is that uh, uh, some kinds of expressions tend to get more frequent because they're more useful, and then as they get more frequent, they sort of get pragmatically weakened and get shorter. But I had to somehow presuppose that that is sort of cumulative, right? And at the time I was sort of semi-satisfied with my explanation because I felt it was better than the explanation that were given earlier. But somehow a few years after publishing that 1999 paper, I kind of stopped working on grammaticalization because I was not satisfied with the answers I was getting. And what I did was I shifted from language change to worldwide language comparison. But still keeping in mind, of course, that languages are flexible and change all the time, and so on. So that language change is always in the background, and there's a lot of variability and so on. But trying to actually uh, understand pathways of change was something that I kind of gave up on. Um, and so I cannot answer your question, but what I find, especially in discussions with Sonia Cristofaro, we had a sort of debate in Paris in September at a conference. She has a pretty strong uh, confidence in our ability to explain certain kinds of language change. So she says this change from this because of inference, or because of reanalysis, or because of this or that. And yeah, of course, sometimes we can make such hypotheses, but for me, language change is more puzzling, I must say, than similarities among languages. It's a little bit like culture change. It's also puzzling. I'm over 60 now, and why are my children who are in their 20s doing things differently? I don't understand it. Uh, but what I do understand is that small children around the world are very similar in many ways, and I don't know. Cultures around the world are very similar in many ways. So I kind of tend to feel that universals are easier to understand than change, also in culture. But I cannot give a hard answer to that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of more questions. I think can start down here, and then Jenny. Great.
So I just wanted to ask, in the talk, you talked about like the enduring popularity of natural kinds linguistics, and how you think that this is a bit mysterious. And I know in a lot of your other work, you've been very critical of a lot of these natural kinds as not holding up to close scrutiny as well as you would need for that kind of linguistics. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether or not there's a connection between this like popularity and appeal of natural kinds linguistics and this functional adaptive thing that you were talking about for most of the talk, in terms of like, is there a functional adaptive reason for things that look like these natural kinds appearing again and again, or is it more so it's a mistake based on centering European languages kind of thing.
So you want me to speculate on evolutionary explanations for the behavior of linguists?
I more so meant, do you think that like some of these natural kinds could be, or things that look like natural kinds could be explained from a functional adaptive perspective?
Okay. I don't really know. I mean, I mentioned the core knowledge by Spelke and others. So where sort of the idea is that, agents and objects and physical properties and quantities and spatial relations, they're really given in advance. So when babies are born, they already have these concepts in a way. So um, uh, I think Spelke would probably be happy with calling them natural kinds, and Ekman would probably also be happy to calling his emotions natural kinds. I'm not sure. I read a paper once by another psychologist, Barrett, who said that emotions are not natural kinds. So apparently people sometimes also talk about natural kinds in cognition. But certainly the idea that some things are sort of there and are not variable is one that is, on the one hand, as I said, probably well-founded. On the other hand, also maybe kind of easy to simply start out with, simply to say, okay, so I go somewhere else and I see some new things, but I cannot say they're completely novel. I have to put them in some other category that already exists. So, I sometimes wonder what did the linguists do who sort of only had the European languages and then first went to the Americas and found Native American languages, and they had some strange things. And so they used Latin categories, but did they think that these indigenous American languages actually had the same categories? So it seems to me that people didn't really think about the difference, so that the different languages could have completely different categories or so. That's probably not so easy to conceive of. Maybe it's similar with social categories. Think of political science. So you have some societies which maybe have something you recognize as a chief, and others have something you recognize as a king, right? So this difference was quite salient, even 2,000 years ago or so. And so when European explorers went elsewhere, they called certain rulers kings and others they called chiefs. So using their categories, and then anthropologists, may have turned kings versus chiefs into some kind of innate category or so. So probably they resisted that and realized that actually each society has its own social categories. They're similar, but you can't really equate them. Whereas in linguistics, maybe because things like agent and patient and property and space and so on are so similar because of the core knowledge that somehow the temptation to really equate them is stronger in linguistics so than in anthropology. I don't know. But I sometimes think about neighboring fields, especially anthropology, and how anthropologists deal with these issues. And probably, anthropologists have kind of never proposed that people are born with an innate category of chief or king, or so, simply because very clearly over most of human history, there have been no kings. So king must be a kind of innovation. Whereas in linguistics, we can imagine that for as long as human language has existed, there has been sort of a plus minus nominative feature or something like that, just as an innate specification when universal grammar was born. So that's as much as I can say there.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually shamelessly ask a question myself, and then we'll go to a question that is online. In my own research, I'm quite interested in these kinds of cognitive biases that other people here at Edinburgh are interested in, but I'm interested in ones that apply during learning versus ones that apply when we innovate aspects of language. And so when you were talking in your presentation here about how the sort of starting point of language would be random, that made me think about my own research field. And I was wondering a little bit if you could speak to, if that's the case, why we see certain similarities in instances of language innovation, like in home sign and in communities of deaf individuals who come together and create new languages, if that starting point is random.
Yeah, I don't know much about sign languages and about the kinds of similarities of change that you've been engaged, that you've been interested in. And of course, saying that change is random is quite provocative, and it was actually meant to be somewhat provocative. And also,
Successfully provoked.
yes, yeah, good, good, yeah. I mean, also in relation to some of my earlier work, because in the 1990s, I really had pretty strong feeling that language change was very regular. So I was very much influenced, not just by Bybee, but also by other grammaticalizationists. And um, I, I really objected to the idea of some uh, generative grammarians like Ian Roberts, for example, in Cambridge, who said that, well, actually, language change, that's just a random walk through the space that is opened by the innate parameters of universal grammar. And I say, well, it's not random. I felt it was sort of very, very regular in many ways. But then I became more skeptical and was kind of trying to sort of pinpoint what the actual regularities were. And I realized that the kinds of changes that I had looked at were mostly changes in European languages and some Near Eastern languages, like Semitic languages or Egyptian or so, where we have kind of longer attestation, and maybe some South Asian languages. But but we don't really know how languages in the Americas changed, or in Australia, or in most of Africa, and so on. And when you look at sign languages, sometimes feel that you can tell something about change, but it's at most a few generations. And I was increasingly struck um, by the tentativeness of the conclusions of research on language change, and also by the researcher biases that I increasingly saw. So I think in the 90s there was a time when I was uh, doing my dissertation and postdoc work. I was a bit naive. I sort of learned about the dangers of biases uh, really only later, as I came in contact with some other fields in psychology, the idea of our minds being biased, work like Kahneman and Tversky and so on, that hadn't occurred to me at the time when I felt that language change was pretty well understood, and so my feeling now is that uh, language change actually isn't so well understood, and that grammaticalization also isn't so well understood. Um, and that, of course, everyone who does work on language change and works on a particular phenomenon, wants to tell a story. I understand that, and often these stories are intriguing and sometimes provocative and so on, but I find them rarely conclusive. And so again, that's sort of the background to what I said, again, putting in some of my biographical history.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read out a question that we have online. So we have a question here. I'm aware that Martin once proposed to go framework free in our grammatical theories. What do you think about universal principles that are in fact theory bound when you go into details? E.g. dependency minimization used by Gibson and Futrell, Hawkins' principle to minimize domains also requires structural analysis.
Well, I think there's a huge difference between structural analysis and theory-bound structural analysis. So, I mean, in that 2010 paper, I made a distinction between theories, which are explanatory, and frameworks, which are, in a way, kind of, sets of descriptive conventions or kind of expectations. And one of the problems I have with much of generative grammar is that there's sort of often a conflation between the descriptive or analytical framework and the theory. So the analytical framework is sort of thought to be a theory. And if the analytical framework is thought to be innate, then that sort of makes sense. And you could think that each analysis of a phenomenon in a language is a test of the hypothesis that the framework is innate. Though de facto, of course, there's so many researcher degrees of freedom, in particular with each analysis, you can actually modify the framework a little bit. And that it doesn't seem to me a recipe for progress. Now, you're right that Hawkins makes specific assumptions about hierarchical relationships of the words that he looks at, and it's similar in the work by Futrell and colleagues, that there are kind of certain assumptions are made, but I think in the Futrell et al. Paper 2020, they're sort of pretty explicit that if you change those assumptions, the results wouldn't change. So the assumptions really have an instrumental character. That was my understanding, and that's really a difference. The explanatory part of the story does not come from the way the tree diagrams are drawn. That's sort of not so easy to see if you look at like all these 50 languages and all the corpora and so on. But I think it can be demonstrated on the basis of a few individual examples. Dependency versus constituency distinction actually is not as big as some people have said it is. So Ted Gibson seems to think that dependency grammar is much better than constituency grammar. I don't think so. I don't think the difference is that big. And for purposes of analyzing pretty large corpora or so, the difference does not really matter.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's all from online and all from in the room. So again, if we could have an applause for Martin. And I also want to give a big thanks to all of our contributing panelists this year. So thank you to Martin Haspelmath, Richard Futrell, Shira Tal here in the room with us, and also Kat Hobater, who is not here, unfortunately, but we are grateful for her presence anyway. We will be back next year with next year's rendition of the L Talks. Martin, if you could send me the version with the references, and I'll make sure to have it uploaded for you. For everybody who's here, we now have a reception. The reception will take place in the Informatics forum, in the mini forum, which is on the 4th floor. If you go up the central stairs and turn right, if you're worried in any way about finding your way, just hang around and walk with me and I will walk you there. But to everybody online, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay.